Scott, I like your line of questioning there. In fact, I was thinking about when I meet God, some of the questions I want to ask him. I'm going to ask him about mosquitoes. I'm going to ask him about termites. I'm going to ask him why, of all the places in the world to put earthquakes and tornadoes, why he picked Oklahoma. Not a big fan of that one. I met a teenager during Bible class today that very seriously asked me, Phil, the thing I'm going to ask God is why he created the Texas Longhorns. It's like, well, wow. It's like, that's really, I won't tell you his name. I don't want him to get judged by any of you. But anyway, glad you're here this morning. It's an important day. If you've been with us all spring, I've been talking a lot about poverty and justice and good deeds and what that looks like. And really, a lot of the messages have been leading up to the so what. Like, what are we really going to do about any of this? So if you've not been with us, we've kind of laid a lot of pieces in place as far as helping us understand poverty. So I did a message a few weeks ago about how poverty is very holistic. It's not just financial. It's not just emotional. It's not just spiritual. It's a very multidimensional part of reality, and so our efforts to engage it have to be pretty holistic. I did a message probably 2 months ago at the heart of one of the big poverty justice passages in the Bible, Matthew 25, and really talked about how God really does have a heart for the poor, and he asks us to have a heart for the poor too. And so today and next week is really the so what of this whole series. This week is about what do we do externally, and then next week will be about what do we do internally to really practice some principles that we can see in Scripture. And so if you have not been with us, or if you're visiting today, or if you just need a reminder, I want to give you just a few verses that'll orient you into the way that God feels throughout the Bible about people in poverty. So we'll begin in the Old Testament. A few passages here. One would be Psalm 140, verse 12. The Lord secures justice for the poor and upholds the cause of the needy. Proverbs 14:31. Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God. Proverbs 29:7. The righteous care about justice for the poor, but the wicked have no such concern. The text in Scripture really couldn't be more clear. From beginning to end, Old Testament, New Testament, God has a huge heart for the poor, and he asks his people to have a heart for the poor as well. Even passages that some people try to somewhat manipulate to say, this probably isn't that big of a deal, like John 12, verse 8, where Jesus says, the poor you will always have with you. Even passages like that, the more I study, they are not meant to have us take them and say, well, we shouldn't care about the poor. You can't get around it. In fact, that particular passage, John chapter 12, verse 8, Jesus is actually quoting an Old Testament passage from Deuteronomy 15. If you'll put this on the screen. The Old Testament passage says, there will always be poor people in your land, therefore be open-handed towards them. You can put the next part of that on the screen. I command you to be open-handed towards them. So when Jesus says the poor are always going to be with you, that's not a cop-out for the fact that maybe we don't need to help the poor. No, what he's saying is, there's always going to be poor people. Therefore, there should always be compassion for these people. So from beginning to end in the Bible, I am convinced that God has a deep, deep, deep concern for the poor. That point could not be more clear to me. The application of that point could not be more messy. For example, several years ago, Oklahoma City made national news because of a poverty story. There was a man down by the outlet mall, panhandler. He was on the side of I-40 and MacArthur, on the side of the street, begging. Police came up to him and said, hey, you don't have a permit to be here. We need you to get off the streets. And a conversation ensued in which one of the police officers said, sir, you need to get off the street and go find yourself a job. To which this panhandler named Shane said something that is so heartwarming. He said, and I quote, I'm lazy, and I made $60,000 doing this last year. Why would I get a job? Doesn't that just make you feel all warm and fuzzy inside? Doesn't that just make you want to invite this man over for Thanksgiving? Like, it's so frustrating when we hear stories like this, because at least for me, I think, okay, God, I get it. I want to be faithful to your word about poverty. But I also want to be helpful to our modern day world of poverty. And how do I do that? When there's people like Shane in the world who, when you try to help these people, they just take advantage of it. Like, what exactly are we supposed to do? You've surely had moments like this, where you meet someone on the side of the road, or maybe you're driving, or you see someone, and you're walking to your workplace, and you see someone, or someone approaches you, and they launch into this really long story, and you're trying to listen through the details, and you're thinking, I don't know exactly what I'm supposed to do to help you. Like, we're all caught in this situation from time to time, and it's really hard to know what exactly we're supposed to do. I'm at a place right now where I have a desire for benevolence, because I think God cares about it. But I also have an awareness of exploitation, because I read stories about shame. And so what is the Christian response to this tension between, yes, I want to do good deeds for poor people, and yet I understand that some people can abuse the system? Well, what are we exactly supposed to do when the rubber meets the road? There's a passage of Scripture in the New Testament that's actually really helpful in this regard. If you have a Bible, I want you to turn to 1 Timothy chapter 5. This passage is not necessarily about poor people in particular. It's actually about widows. But Paul lays down a principle in 1 Timothy chapter 5 that I think is so helpful when it comes to how we engage people in poverty. I said a few weeks ago that it's really good to have a heart for the poor, but it's even better to have a plan for the poor. 1 Timothy chapter 5, to me, of all the passages in the whole Bible, is the best text of Scripture to think about how to help the poor. And so the background here is that there's a lot of widows in this church. Paul's writing to Timothy, and Timothy's overseeing and helping out with this church, and there's a lot of widows. And some of these widows are receiving help from the church, and it's a really good thing. There are other widows who are more or less abusing the system. And so Paul is giving his advice to Timothy as far as what he should do about this situation. Starting in verse 3, here's what Paul says. Give proper recognition to those widows who are really in need. So you might notice, even from the outset, Paul is hinting at there are some widows who are really in need, and there are some widows who might not be so much in need. Verse 4, he gets a little more clear about this. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, these should first of all learn to put their religion into practice by caring for their own family, and so repaying their parents and grandparents, for this is pleasing to God. So as a side note here, this is a great passage for caretakers. And I know some of you in this room, you spend a lot of time with your family members day after day caring for your parents or caring for your grandparents, and it's really easy to think, well, no one knows how much of a burden this is, and it's really easy just to get bogged down in that kind of living. Read 1 Timothy 5 and realize that when you take care of whoever that person is, in the nitty-gritty of life, doing all the details that you don't really want to do, you are living out your faith. You are putting your religion into practice, and that's a really, really good thing. Back to the main train of thought here. Paul is saying, Timothy, help the widows that really need help. But if they have family, if that widow's got a son with a job, that son can help her. And she doesn't necessarily need to be on the list of widows that the church is helping. That's what he's getting at. In fact, in verse 9, Paul gets really specific about this list. Here's what he says, verse 9. No widow may be put on the list of widows unless she is over 60, has been faithful to her husband, and is well known for her good deeds, such as bringing up children, showing hospitality, washing the feet of the Lord's people, helping those in trouble, and devoting herself to all kinds of good deeds. So what exactly is Paul laying down here? This is benevolence criteria. He's saying, Timothy, you got to have a list of things that you look for, and if they match the list, then if they match these requirements, then you put them on the list and help them. But if they don't help them. And so just to be clear, here's the list, at least for the next with Paul. Paul says, number one, they got to be 60 years old. They got to be faithful to their husband, and they have to be a producer of good deeds. And so Paul says, if they meet these criteria, yeah, you should definitely help them. But if they don't, and this sounds really cruel, And a lot of us don't feel comfortable with this, but if they don't meet the criteria, Paul says, don't put them on the list. Don't help them. That's what he says in the very next verse, verse 11. As for younger widows, do not put them on such a list. I mean, realize the gravity of what he's saying there, because this would make some of us uncomfortable. He's saying, don't give them money. He's saying, don't give them food. Don't give them shelter, because those were the kinds of things that scholars say would happen to widows on the list. And Paul's saying, no, don't help them in that way. And here's why, verse 13. They get into the habit of being idle and going about from house to house. And not only do they become idlers, but also busybodies who talk nonsense, saying things they ought not to say. And so scholars in the commentaries I read they really try to reconstruct what's happening in this church. And what they think is really going on here is you have some widows that really do need help. And they don't have family to take care of them. And and Paul says, yes, put them on the list. But then you have a certain group of widows, probably the younger ones, and they have family members, and they'll go over to their family members and they will say, hey, can I have money? Can I have food? Can I have some shelter? And they'll get that. And then they'll go over to the church and say, hey, can I have money? Can I have food? Can I have shelter? And so some of these widows are double dipping. And what's happening is that they are actually becoming somewhat wealthy in that context, and they don't have any work. And what Paul is noticing is that they're just walking around town. They're the town gossips. They're the idle people. They're the busybodies that are actually causing more harm for the church community than good. And so Paul's saying, Timothy, that can't be. You need to establish these criteria that, yes, if a widow really needs help, we'll help her. But if she doesn't, if she's got to help other places, you do not need to help her. So here's the principle that I think you can take from this passage and then apply to modern day poverty. Here it is. The most effective plan for the poor includes compassion and wisdom, or the more effective plan for the poor includes both compassion and wisdom. So you got to have both. So for a lot of us, we're really good about the compassion one, but what can happen is if you fully lead with compassion and never think about wisdom, is this the wise thing to give? Is this the wise thing to do? Then what happens is we might feel good about something. Wow, I devoted my time to this person, or I gave my money to this person. But at the end of the day, what happens is it is possible to do more harm than good. Or as the title of another one of the books says, it's possible for your charity to be toxic because you're actually enabling people instead of doing things which will help them. How do you think Shane makes $60,000 a year? It's because some people are not practicing wise compassion. Now, I'll also say on the other hand, if you have all wisdom and no compassion, you're probably not going to help anybody. Because if that's you, if you have all wisdom, no compassion, you're probably going to be so concerned and afraid that someone's going to take advantage of you that you just won't help anybody. You're going to be so skeptical, so worried that someone's going to abuse the system that you're just going to hold all your time and all your resources and all your money, and you're just not going to help anyone. You'll be the spiritual equivalent of the TSA at the airport, always assuming the worst in everybody. Well, that's probably not the best way to go either as far as a Christian is concerned. We don't want to be cold and calculating, but neither do we want to be gullible. So how does a Christian actually practice this principle of wise compassion? How do we be wise and compassionate at the same time? I want to give you 3 ways to practice this principle. First one is this: choose development over relief, or more than relief. Choose development more than relief. I'll explain what these terms mean. So relief would be short-term product. Someone needs a bottle of water, you give them a bottle of water. Someone needs a sandwich, you give them a sandwich. Someone needs a temporary stay at a hotel for a few days, you give them that. Short-term product. Development is defined as long-term process. Development is really getting people to re-engage society. So development involves jobs. Development involves networking. Development involves life skills, friendships, mentoring. It's up on a higher level. So relief, short-term. In relief, you might even think when there's a disaster, when there's a hurricane, when there's a tornado, relief is really important in the short term, but development is something that happens in the long term. And so when you think about the way that you engage with people in poverty, generally, when you can lean into development, that's what you want to do because that makes more of a difference in the long term. I'll give you 2 examples. One would be an organization called New Day out of Baltimore. It's one of the leading poverty ministries in the country. And so what they specialize in is they specialize in helping poor people build their own homes. And so they'll partner with poor people and they'll give them a few resources, but the poor have to work really hard to build their homes. And when they first started years ago, they were really criticized because the first house that they did with poor people took them 4 years to build. And it wasn't a big house. And so a lot of people criticized Mark Gornick, the founder of this ministry, and they said, Mark, what are you doing? You're not going to be productive. You're not going to be efficient if you're only producing one house every 4 years. And I love what Mark said in response to this criticism. You can put this quote on the screen. Mark says, we're not interested in building homes primarily. We're interested in building people, in leaders, in community, in jobs. So you see what Mark's doing. He's leaning into development, not just relief. Development helps with the long term. Relief helps with the short term. I'll give you another example, a local example. Skyler Moore is a young adult in our church family. He grew up here, has been here a long time, super compassionate guy. 8-9 years ago, he and 2 friends really had a heart for poor people, and they decided they wanted to go through a season of learning. And so they decided that they were going to get their sleeping bags, and for 1 week, they were going to live on the streets of downtown Oklahoma City to try to understand the culture a little bit better. Well, I remember visiting Skyler and his friends down there like on day 3 and asking how they were doing it, and they said, this is way harder than we ever thought it would be. They would sleep by dumpsters in their sleeping bags. They said their days were in a lot of ways full of boredom. They would walk around, meet other homeless people, have a meal here, have a meal there, but they experienced what it felt like to be more or less the refuse of society. No one cared about them. No one really gave them attention. And they said it was really, really hard to get through it for 1 week. About a month later, after Skyler had time to process it, I had lunch with him and I said, all right, tell me, based on your experience of living in downtown OKC for 1 week, what do people in poverty need? And he said, I'll never forget what he said. He said, Philip, they don't need shelter. If you're smart, you can get shelter. There's a lot of places with beds, and if you're smart, you can get a bed. Number 2, they don't necessarily even need food. There are so many places that offer daily meals that if they really want to, and they know the system and understand it, they can get 3 meals a day. But the one thing that they do not have is they have nobody to listen to them. They are absolutely isolated, and they have no friends. And what I learned is that these people, more than anything else, they just need Christian men and Christian women just to listen to their stories. Isn't that fascinating? That's what he learned in 1 week. And so what's he leaning into there? Well, again, he's leaning into development. These people need friends. And this is really hard for some of us to hear because a lot of us are kind of type A driven. We're successful. For some of us people, we do things at our jobs. We're just go, 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 go. And so we want the project. Like we want to do something that we can see the results immediately. So we like building the house or we like serving the meal because that makes us feel good. But at the end of the day, remember, just sitting with someone for 30 or 45 minutes might be the best thing that you could possibly do for someone in poverty. They just need friends. They need someone that is going to listen. So make sure to remember, between development and relief, choose development more than you choose relief. Now, I'll also say this. This doesn't mean we never choose relief. Sometimes relief is actually in the shortest possible thing that you can do. In fact, just this weekend I was talking to a lady who lives across the street. Her name is Becca. She's married to a guy named Jay, and she said I could tell this story. Their house burned down just a few weeks ago. And some members at our church, Joe Crawford, Lee Williams, they found out about it. And so for the last several weeks, they've been helping this family. They've been giving them food. They've been doing some temporary fundraising just to help them with temporary lodging. What Becca was telling me on the phone is she was saying that the Red Cross is great, but they're taking a really, really long time to get involved with helping their family. So they need help. Like at this point, this family, they need relief. And so I say that because don't use development as a cop-out. Don't walk around thinking, well, I'm a strategic Christian now, and so therefore I'm not going to give you anything. No, sometimes God's going to put you in a certain moment where what you need to do is you need to give food or water or shelter or resources. So I'm not saying never lean into relief, but I'm just saying in general, if you wanted to make a long-term difference for people in poverty, you got to lean into development more than you do relief. And so what this means very practically, just giving you ideas here, very practical ideas. One would be maybe you get to work 30 minutes early and you intentionally walk around your workplace trying to maybe strike up a conversation with someone that might be in poverty. That might be something you could do. For business owners, maybe there's a way you could create a job within your system or organization to employ someone that might be a risk because this person might not work out. But people in poverty, they need jobs. And those of you who have businesses, it could be a great ministry to take a risk on someone in poverty. So there's two practical ideas. Here's the second practice to carry out this principle of wise compassion. Choose pointing more than fixing. Okay, let's just so you remember this one. Everybody take your finger out and just point at someone else in the room. Everybody just point at someone. Pick someone you're angry at. Give them an angry look. Okay, that's pointing. Okay, now everybody do this and kind of lean back. And everybody say, I've got this. Yeah. This is what we do when we try to fix things. This is the attitude. It's like, I got this. So what pointing is connecting. And so sometimes you just need to connect somebody to somebody else. So you might point someone to this nonprofit or this organization or this person or this church. That's pointing. Fixing is when you think and I think, well, I have to be the hero. I have to be the one to solve this situation. This is not on the screen, but this is one to remember here. I'll have you repeat it. Say, I am a resource, not the source. We'll do that one again. I am a resource, not the source. Okay, you got to remember that one. You can't fix everything. And I'll be totally honest, I have made big mistakes on this particular one. I'll tell you a story. 6-7 years ago, I met a guy in poverty. He was actually walking through the snow, didn't have a car. He was freezing cold. I gave him a ride to his temporary motel where he was staying. We struck up a conversation. Well, I'll call him Tom. And we actually developed somewhat of a relationship over the next 3-4 months. And I tried so hard to help him. He had a really sad story. He was originally born in India, really smart, spoke 5 languages, had come to the States, was completely disowned by his parents. His girlfriend had just broke up with him. His best friend had just died suddenly in his 30s. And so this guy he was really broken. He just lost his job. He was really depressed. And I was trying so hard. To help this guy. And so I did a lot. I bought him several meals. I made a lot of phone calls for him, trying to find him a place to live. I actually found someone that went to our church at the time that volunteered to be his roommate. He didn't have a driver's license, so I was working really hard on trying to figure out how I could help him get places. I would take him, I would give him rides all the time. Like, I did so much to try to help this guy out. Well, I'll never forget, about 3 or 4 months into this, and I'm investing a lot of hours into this, I get a call from his roommate one day. And his roommate says, Phil, I'm sorry, I had to kick Tom out. Tom just kept coming home, and I kept telling him he had to stop coming home drunk, and he couldn't do it. Kept coming home drunk, and so I'm sorry, I had to kick him out. And I was so discouraged because I had spent so much time trying to fix this man, and it just wasn't happening. A few days later, I get a call from St. Anthony's Hospital. Tom didn't have hardly any friends, and I was one of the only people he had saved in his phone, and so they had called me, and they said, Tom's in the hospital. He tried to take his own life. So I drive down to St. Anthony's, and I'll never forget walking into his room, and he's lying on the bed. His eyes are rolling in the back of his head. He's convulsing because he's overdosed on a drug. And I stood there by his bed. He had no clue I was there. He doesn't remember it at all. There was no family, no friends. At that point, even the nurses had left the room, and I was just standing next to this man. But in that moment, I do remember, I think God taught me a profound lesson, which is really important for all of us to hear. And it's this: you can't fix people. You can't fix people. I can't fix people. And what I had been trying to do was fix him. I couldn't. Well, he got out of the hospital, and he left. He went to San Antonio. 5 years later, he came back to Edmond, and he visited me. And he came into my office, and I'll never forget this. He was sober. He was employed. He was well-spoken. He seemed really emotionally healthy. He seemed to like his life and his job. And I was just like, in my head, I was thinking, how did this happen? I tried so hard. Well, guess how it happened? In San Antonio, he went to a rehab program. He got into therapy. He got involved at a local church. He started going to Celebrate Recovery. So all these factors started influencing him. And so what mistake did I make? I tried to be the hero. I thought I was the source, not a resource. And if I could have done it all over again, I would have done a lot more pointing and not as much fixing. Because again, you can't fix people. And so as you encounter people that are really down on their luck, people in poverty, remember, you need to point them. So places you can point them, there's a lot of nonprofits in Oklahoma City that you can point people towards. And I would recommend that if you encounter a lot of people in poverty, it's probably really important that you become well-versed as far as what organization does what. I'll also say you can point people here. We have a benevolence team, and they meet with every year hundreds of people, and we help out a lot of people in poverty. Just like Paul in 1 Timothy 5, they have criteria that they go through to help people in poverty, and we do some relief work, but a lot of what we do, it turns into development. And so know that our church is a resource if you don't exactly know what to do. So remember, choose pointing more than fixing. Now, I'll give you one more really clear example here. Since we're on this point, we all need to hear this one because we're all a part of it. What do we do when panhandlers sit outside our parking lot after second service? This happened about 3-4 months ago. How many of you were leaving the south entrance and saw the panhandlers there? Raise your hand if you saw it. A lot of people in first service did. Maybe he left during Bible class. I've heard this story a lot. A few months ago, this guy was out, and a lot of people didn't know what to do. And like you're driving, it's like, it's one thing to be driving in the middle of the city, but like if you drive out of a church parking lot, you're like, oh, should I give? Should I not give? I don't want to go to hell. I guess I'll, it's hard. Like, what are you supposed to do? And so a lot of people told me, they were like, well, I didn't know what to do. Some of you gave, some of you didn't give. Well, I want to tell you behind the scenes what happened. 2 church leaders walked out to this man on 2 separate occasions, and they said, hey, we're really glad you're here. Our church loves helping people in your situation. Would you mind coming in? We'd love to sit down and visit with you, hear your story so we can be most helpful to you. Well, guess what the guy says? The guy says, no, I'm going to stay right here because I know what I'm doing. Basically, that's his job. And he was hoping to make a lot of money on that day. So did this help anybody? I mean, think about what happened this day. We've got 25% of you that gave, and you've got 75% of you that drove on and felt guilty, and then we've got 2 of our leaders who are rejected. Like, who wins in this situation? Nobody. And so just so we can all be on the same page, in fact, I'll let Steve Corbett speak into this. He wrote When Helping Hurts. Here's what he says about situations like this. The most loving thing for communities to do for abusers of the system is for the entire community to withhold relief, empowering the person to change and find long-term solutions. So the best thing for us to do is to be on the same page. And so I'll tell you, when this does happen again, I'm giving you permission, like as the preacher, it is okay if you want to drive on. I'll go to hell for you. Don't worry about it. Like, if you need to drive on, that's okay. But secondly, so here are 2 things you can do. One, it is okay to drive. One, we'll be talking to this person. Second thing, if you want to roll down your window, just so we're all on the same page, the best thing to say is, we would love to help you out. Would you mind coming into our church building and visiting with one of our leaders so we can hear your story? That's the best thing to say because, again, it does no good. It does no good for us to hurt people by trying to be compassionate. So choose pointing more than fixing. Now, I'll hedge a little bit before I move on to the third point. There are some times where you will encounter a situation where you can do something and you can fix a situation that would be the right thing to do. For example, several years ago, or about 1 year ago, Anna and Heidi, my daughters, we met a guy whose tire had just blown out on the side of the road. Now, would it do any good for me to drive by him and say, Hibden's that way? No, like the guy didn't have a ride. Like in that moment, it was very tangible. It was very clear. We got out of the car. We helped the guy. We drove him to Hibden. We got him a tire. In that moment, I actually think fixing was appropriate. So again, I'm not saying that you can use all this wisdom, strategic thinking as a cop-out to do what's right in the moment. Sometimes God might be calling you to do something in the moment. In general, choose pointing more than fixing. Final point I want to make here is you're still going to get involved in situations where you don't know what to do. And you hear lessons like this, you read the literature, and you're still like, I don't know, this is a gray area. When you get to those moments, here's where I'm at, and you could disagree with me, and that's okay, but where I'm at, after reading about this for the last several months, poring over the text, when I don't know what to do, I'm going to choose love more than skepticism. If you got to choose, lean into love. Because as much as we read about this, and as much as we study this, and as much as we try to figure this out, you're still going to get caught in situations where you don't know what to do. Do I give or do I not give? Do I engage? Do I not engage? Do I help? Do I not help? We don't know what to do. See, here's the truth. If you always choose skepticism over love, two things are going to happen. One, that will decrease your chances of getting misused by somebody else. But if you always choose skepticism over love, it will also decrease your chances of getting used by God. You see, we all have to live in this gray space, and so at the end of the day, I'm going to lean into love, knowing that I might get taken advantage of. And I might get abused in certain situations, and maybe my money won't go where I want it to go. But at the end of the day, I got to lean into love because that's where God leans. He takes the risk into love. In fact, I think I made a lot of mistakes with Tom years ago, but one particular memory really strikes me as it was the right thing to do. Skyler Moore was also involved in this story, but as we were getting to know Tom better and realizing how broken he was and how he just had a whole history of baggage, we were talking to him one day and realized that he hadn't had a birthday party in 5-6 years. And so Skyler and I and a few other friends found out when his birthday was, and while he was out and about one day, we went to his roommate's house and we put up a big banner that said happy birthday. We got a cake, lit some candles, got several gifts. And just the 5 or 6 of us were there when he walked in the front door, and we yelled, surprise, and I'll never forget the look on Tom's face. He just starts weeping because he hadn't experienced that kind of love in a really, really long time. And if I had to do that story again with Tom, there's a lot of things I would do differently, but that particular moment, I'd do it the same every single time. Because I was leaning into love. And it just felt right to give him that gift of the birthday. So the birthday party, when you find yourself not knowing what to do, just lean into love more than you lean into skepticism. I read this great quote from Surprised by Hope. I'll let this be the final thing I'll say in the sermon. It's a long quote, but N.T. Wright's talking about that what we do matters in our day. It really, really matters. And he's trying to encourage his readers just not to give up, because what you do in the moment has a lot of power from God. So I want to read this quote and then we'll be done. Dr. Wright says this: what you do in the Lord is not in vain. You are not oiling the wheels of a machine that's about to roll over a cliff. You're not restoring a great painting that's shortly going to be thrown into the fire. You're not planting roses in a garden that's about to be dug up for a building site. You are, strange though it may seem, almost as hard to believe as the resurrection itself, you are accomplishing something that will come in due course, part of God's new world. Every act of love and gratitude, kindness, every work of art, of music inspired by the love of God and delight in the beauty of His creation, every minute spent teaching a severely handicapped child to read or walk, every act of care and nurture, of comfort and support for one's fellow human being, and of course, every prayer, all Spirit-led teaching, every deed that spreads the gospel, builds the church, embraces and embodies holiness rather than corruption, and makes the name of Jesus honored in the world. All of this will find its way through the resurrecting power of God into the new creation that God will make one day. That is the logic of the mission of God. I love that quote because he's really getting us to believe this principle that what you do really matters. And tomorrow morning you wake up, you're gonna talk to a dozen people, maybe 30, 40 people tomorrow. That matters. Every single thing you do for the least of these in the world has power in the kingdom of God. So please, do not give up. Is working with the poor messy? Absolutely. But as Isaiah says, we have to spend ourselves on behalf of the poor. It's not going to be easy. And there's no easy solution to this. But I'm encouraging you, keep leaning into this subject because God cares so much about it. And he cares about you. And we're about to sing a song, and as we do every week, if this church can help you, I want you to come tell me about it. We had a powerful response in first service. Patty Simmons came down and basically said, my dad is financially poor and he's spiritually poor and he's addicted to alcohol and I don't know what to do. And we met with Patty and we prayed with her. A lot of you have people in your life and you don't know what to do because they're stuck in poverty and you need to be wise, but you're just not sure how to do that. If you want us to pray for you, someone you love, we'll do that this morning. If you want to give your life to Christ in baptism, it's a great thing to do. You come tell me about it. Let's stand and let's sing.